Demand curves, part of our Week 2 lectures on demand. In this video, we'll talk about turning demand, either individual or aggregate demand, into demand curves, and how changes in markets can affect demand curves. Now, we used this example previously in our video on individual demand. This is the demand for Brandeis notebooks, and here's the demand schedule for the demand for Brandeis notebooks. And what we can do is we can represent that on a graph. And here's a graph where we've graphed the demand for notebooks on versus the price. And what you'll see here is you'll see that price is on the y-axis and quantity demanded is on the x-axis. Now, if you've taken some math classes that get into a little bit of what graphs should look like, this is actually the opposite of how a graph like this should look like, because the y-axis should be how the result of what's happening on the x-axis. Now the problem is that economists have been graphing demand and supply this way from long before people understood that about graphs. So we've kind of settled on this presentation of demand and supply, even though it's kind of backwards. So what we see is when the price changes on the left, the quantity is going to change along the bottom. So this is the demand for notebooks based on different prices. And this is with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. The other thing I want to tell you about this graph is that note that there are no fractional notebooks allowed, that the person whose demand we're mapping here or charting here might demand 2 whole notebooks or 3 whole notebooks. There's no fractional demand. No fractions are allowed here. Now, if fractions are allowed, what we'll see is a little bit different. We're going to see a demand curve that looks like this. And so this is the same demand if the market sells fractions of a notebook. And see, this is a straight line, while the previous demand was like a staircase pattern. And so that's the big difference between allowing fractional notebooks and allowing whole notebooks. Allowing fractional notebooks allows us to have this nice clean line, and that's why in most cases we're going to assume that fractional notebooks are allowed. In fact, we won't think that fractional notebooks are not allowed, or fractional whatever are not allowed, unless we specify that specifically in a question. So these are 2 different kinds of graphing of demand, what we call a demand curve. Now, you could say the first one isn't a curve, it's like a staircase. The second one isn't really a curve, it's a line, although a line is a kind of curve. And really, these are the 2 main ways that demand is represented. But that doesn't mean those are the only 2 ways. There's nothing wrong with a demand curve that looks like this, where there's an actual curve, and that the price, initial price drops don't affect quantity that much, but then later on, further price drops affect quantity a lot more. And for any of these demand curves, what we can do is draw a line across from the price until it hits the demand curve, and then draw a line straight down to the quantity to figure out the quantity demanded. In this case, I didn't really mark any numbers, so if the price is P1, we see that the quantity demanded in this case is Q1. You can imagine seeing here that if the price increased to some higher price P2, the quantity would decrease to some lower quantity Q2. Now, I want to ask you, what do graphs like this show exactly? What the 2 variables show on this graph, they show how the quantity demanded for a good responds to a change in price for the good. But we all know that price is only one thing that could change in a market that might affect how much demand we see in a marketplace. You can think about the notebooks again, and you can imagine other things besides price that could affect how many notebooks that you would want to buy, or how many notebooks the country would want to buy. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to sort of think about the different things that could affect demand for notebooks. So some other factors include your income or the income of a whole nation. It could include the prices of other goods. It could include regulations about notebooks. It could include network effects, and it could include informational effects. So let me go through these each in a little bit of detail. So income would be your own personal income. If all of a sudden your income was cut in half, like a news article we saw today about the pandemic response and the economic impacts of the pandemic, then you're going to have a different level of demand for your notebooks. If the prices of other goods change, if all of a sudden the price of plain notebooks went down and was very inexpensive, your demand for Brandeis notebooks may also go down. If the price of other blank notebooks went way up, your demand for Brandeis notebooks might go up. Regulation. So if notebooks were somehow banned, or if shipping became more problematic due to postal service issues, we could imagine that also demand might change. Network effects. If all of your friends are buying Brandeis notebooks, it's possible that you might also want to buy a Brandeis notebook. And finally, information. If all of a sudden it came out that Brandeis notebooks were of poor quality, or if Brandeis notebooks somehow contributed to dust in the air or something like that, we could also imagine demand shifting. So these are all different other factors that might impact the demand that we see for a good, either for an individual consumer or for all consumers. So we can't map these things on our graph. They're just not represented. We have price and we have quantity. We don't have any of these other things. So how do we on this graph show that the demand would have changed if people's income has changed? If you could think about it, we could almost imagine a third axis coming out from the screen that would indicate income, and that we could sort of slide up that third axis and the demand curve would look different. Now, that's going to help some people who have good three-dimensional sense. But for the rest of us, we just need to memorize a simple rule. And the simple rule is this. Given a demand curve like this, anything except price that changes demand would cause a shift in the demand curve. In this case, the demand for t-shirts are out of style. So that causes Horace's demand to shift left. At the same price, his quantity demanded is less. So that's an example of a demand curve shifting. The demand curve shifts when something besides price changes demand. Now, if the price somehow just gets higher, then that results in a movement along the demand curve. Now, how does the price get higher? Well, most of the time, the price gets higher because there's a change in the supply curve. So most of the time, the change in the supply curve causes movement along the demand curve, a change in price that causes movement along the demand curve. Not always, but most of the time. A change in the price causes movement along the demand curve, because a change in price is not a change in demand. A change in price is a change in quantity demanded. So, again, things that aren't price shift the demand curve, but price does not shift the demand curve. The thing is that things that primarily affect supply tend to be the ones that cause a movement along the demand curve. So, if price or supply isn't changing demand, then we call that a shift in the demand curve. We shift the curve horizontally. Either we shift the demand curve left or we shift the demand curve right. Now, that's the terminology the textbook uses, so that's what I'm going to use in this class. Some people will talk about shifting the demand curve up or shifting the demand curve down. Down is the same as left. Up is the same as right. The two can be used interchangeably. I'm going to try to stick to left and right. So, we can represent individual or aggregate demand using a demand curve. A change in price or a change in the supply curve results in movement along the demand curve. A change in any other demand factors results in a shift in the demand curve. Thank you.